In today's lesson, we are going to be talking about shooting in low light. Low light gets its own entire lesson because it's a whole thing, and there are a lot of little bits of information and knowledge that go into taking a successful low light image. Low light images are just hard in general because, as we've learnt from the exposure triangle, if we have less ambient light available, we need to get this light back from somewhere to maintain our exposure using some other pillar of the exposure triangle. It then gets a whole lot trickier than depending on what type of photography we're doing with low light photography. Portrait and street photography in particular can be quite difficult initially when we're still trying to figure out the exposure triangle because they require faster shutter speeds than cityscapes or landscapes. And sometimes that may mean that our gear can reach the limit of acceptable ISO values even at the widest aperture. So, in other words, you've just run out of light with the gear that you've got. Low light scenarios are one of those situations where your gear can determine just how far you can push your settings and therefore your ability to capture a well exposed image. As an example, if you need, let's say, 1/400th of a shutter speed to take some street shots at night handheld and it's dark, then you need to get your light from somewhere. And if it's already at, let's say, ISO 3200 and a minimum of f4 on an APS-C camera, for example, then you're pretty much at the limit. The only real option there is to lower your shutter speed, but then you expose yourself to the risk of your images being blurry. And at that point, there's not really much else you can do unless you externally light your subject or move to a different location. Now, many photographers, when they first start out with nighttime photography, experience this kind of, I would say it's a kind of wall. And from here, you kind of find yourself constantly coming up against this like mild restraint. And this is where gear ends up having advantages. So let's talk about how the gear can give us more light and cleaner images. Moving up from APS-C to full frame, for example, will give you about 1 to 2 stops of average clean usable ISO. So you could go from ISO 3200 to a potential ISO 12800 just by upgrading the body alone. Conversely, you could get more stops of light with a faster lens as well. The same change of ISO 3200 to ISO 12800 is actually the same as going from a lens with an aperture of f4 to an aperture of f1.8, which we've mentioned before is a good mid-range spot for prime lenses. You really have to experiment with your own style of shooting and come up against these limitations for yourself by experiencing it for yourself and seeing if certain conditions prohibit you from shooting a particular scene in the way that you would realistically want to. So I highly recommend that you get out there and shoot some low light photography images. Gear aside, though, there are plenty of other things that help with low light photography, so we'll go through some of them now. So this is going to seem very rudimentary, but the way that you actually hold your camera matters. That's because stability matters, and how you hold your camera can have a huge influence on that. Some general rules of thumb when shooting a camera is to always have two hands on it whenever you can, and the most point of contact, especially stable ones, if you so happen to be leaning on something, the better. Always have your left hand cupping the lens from underneath like this, never from the top. Holding it from the top provides very little stabilization, and it's a very easy way to show people that you're new to photography. Holding it from underneath the lens in conjunction with your right hand allows both of your arms to rest underneath your camera naturally, supporting it from below. And you can take this a step further, and rather than flaring your elbows out like this, then you can bring them together like this so that they're touching your torso. And locking in yourself like this will allow for an additional point of contact. When you take this a step further and put your eye to the eyepiece while keeping your elbows tucked, you will create a triangle of contact with your body. Your eyes touch the camera via the eyepiece, the camera is supported by your hands, and your elbows against the torso act as a brace to hold everything together. And this is the most stable way to shoot your camera. From here, when you're looking around, use your torso and legs to turn rather than your arms. Another thing to add to that is when you're actually pressing the shutter, don't slam your finger down on it. When you have too much force on the shutter button, you can actually accidentally end up shaking the entire camera when you press the shutter. Instead, gently half press to focus the camera and slowly and gently press deeper for the shutter press. The idea is to be as gentle as you can while being forceful enough to actuate the shutter button. And thankfully, shutter buttons are already pretty sensitive, so you actually don't need to press it very much. And again, I know this might seem really basic, but again, being stable when you're actually controlling the camera can mean that you don't need such a high shutter speed to combat all of the shake that we can accidentally introduce by pressing the shutter button too hard or being too wobbly on our cameras when we are handling them. If we can save what we can here by combating camera shake, then we can use those stops of light we gain by combating that somewhere else. But there is one kind of trump card that we have up our sleeves, and even though it's not an absolute save all, it most certainly can help, and that is stabilization. Most cameras these days have in-body image stabilization, or IBIS for short. How this works at a basic level is that the sensor is essentially cradled by an internal stabilization device that counteracts the movements that you make almost like a gimbal. It acts to keep the sensor stable at all times and works to prevent your camera shakes from rocking the sensor too much. And it does actually tremendously help with things like shutter shake when you press the shutter button too hard, or other micro shakes that you might introduce as well, but it doesn't ever work really well for large, big shakes. Now, while the technology is great to have, it is not something that we should be depending on all of the time. A better approach is just to turn it on and forget that it's on, and then focus on handling our cameras properly at the same time. Now keep in mind that also stabilization is no replacement for shutter speed. A big mistake some new photographers make is they think that when they have stabilization on, they can suddenly reduce their shutter speeds to suit, but this isn't the case. Sure, it might help you hit your targets more reliably if you're shooting handheld, and it will absolutely still help when shooting something like 1/15th of a second, but the shutter speed rules still apply. If you want to freeze the action in your composition, you're very likely not going to be able to do so at 1/15th of a second and under. It's at these kinds of shutter speeds that you start to have a very, very high chance of your images not turning out sharp. So please make sure that you are still following the proper rules of the exposure triangle and only thinking about camera stabilization as an aid for the camera shake that you, as the camera operator, might introduce, and nothing else. Now, in addition to IBIS, nowadays, camera manufacturers are also introducing digital stabilization as well. And they do this by slightly cropping into the image a little bit and using the extra pixels on the sides that they've cropped out as a buffer against your shakes. And when manufacturers have settings where the embodied image stabilization and digital stabilization is used, well, then things can get very, very buttery smooth very quickly, and that is amazing. And this is really useful for video more than it is for photos, because in photography, we can fight camera shake with being flexible on the shutter speed, where in video, shutter speeds aren't as flexible. But either way, it's nice to have that option. With all this talk about camera shake and making sure we're handling our cameras correctly, there is one device, one tool that allows us to take camera shake completely out of the equation, and that is using tripods. So tripods are three-legged camera stands that we place our cameras on so that we can keep them still. When a camera is on the tripod, there is no shutter speed that is too low that we can use. We could leave a camera on a tripod and leave the shutter going all day if we wanted to. And in fact, that's how more advanced techniques like time lapses and astrophotography are required to be taken on tripods, being left for hours and hours at a time. When taking really low light images, tripods are essential. While you may or may not use tripods regularly, I personally don't, it is a must in every single photographer's toolkit, because eventually there will be a need to use one, and it is a great idea to learn all of the techniques and all of the advantages associated with using a tripod, because they can be very handy sometimes. Now, tripods come in all shapes and sizes, and you can get tiny ones, and you can get travel ones, and you can get big ones. In most cases, tripods will be able to be packed down or extended out to become shorter or longer depending on what you need in the scene. They're made up of all sorts of different materials, from hard plastics to steel and aluminium, and even more exotic materials such as carbon fiber and titanium as well. The idea of a tripod is to be as sturdy and as steady as possible, and each material and length type of a tripod have a different effect on this. Generally, the longer the tripod and the heavier the material it's made out of, the more sturdy it's going to be. Carbon fiber is an exception to this, as it is commonly used on higher end tripods due to its amazing strength yet very lightweight, which makes it amazing to travel with and still remain stable. Now, to start with, I would recommend just buying a cheap tripod that is at least 1.5 meters or so when extended, so that you can then venture into using tripods in low light situations or other advanced techniques, which we will cover in this course. Tripods can become very expensive very, very quickly, so understand whether or not your style or genre of photography requires tripods, because you may or may not want to spend more time and more budget around your tripod purchase if your genre of photography calls for it. Time to take some low light images. So for today's assignment, the idea is to understand your current setup and whether it has limitations on low light performance or not. So after the sun sets, go for a walk outside and take some photographs on your walk. Make sure to take images at least, I would say, like every 15 minutes or so for about 2 hours until it gets completely dark. And what you're trying to notice here is when you get home and you review your images, what kind of settings do you use as the night gets darker and darker? For example, if you're on a 1-inch sensor, you might find that even if you go super slow on the shutter speed and wide open on the aperture, that 30 minutes past sunset, you find yourself already at ISO 1600, and that's kind of it. Pushing to ISO 3200 for that camera might be too much and might look too grainy, and that's as far as you can go with that setup. That's the objective you're trying to get to. Just how far can you push your gear until it gets to the point of unusable? If you have a little bit more gear and you have primes and zooms in your kit, then play around with those and see how it changes the settings and what kind of images you can take with the relevant settings that you have. If you have a fast prime and a full frame sensor, then you can shoot most of the night and still be okay if you're in a city or something like that. The objective is to find where that endpoint is for you based on the dwindling light and the amount of gear that you have currently. All right, have fun with that one. See you tomorrow.